Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on how to set up a new endowment fund. I assume people are filtering in, so we'll give everyone a moment to join.
And Karsten, I think you all are good to go. So welcome to those who are coming into the room. We're glad to have you with us. I'm Joe Swimmer, the Executive Director of Episcopal Parish Network. Pleased to be partnering with Episcopal Church Foundation and their Endowment Solutions Group on this particular session. It's going to be really informative and helpful for you all to engage with Ann and Karsten. Reminders, please put your questions and comments into the Q&A. This is different from our normal digital workshops. Please use the Q&A for your questions and comments, and do put your information of where you are dialing in from into the chat, so folks know what your name is and what parish, city, state you're dialing in from. That would be great. And with that, Karsten, Ann, take it away, and thank you all. We'll see many of you in Houston in a little over a month.
Great. Thank you, Joe. Welcome again, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on how to set up a new endowment fund. My name is Karsten Sierk. I'm the Director of Endowment Management at the Episcopal Church Foundation, and I'm joined today by my close colleague, Ann Richardson. Ann is ECF's Senior Program Director for Investor Relations. Many thanks again to the Episcopal Parish Network and to Joe Swimmer for organizing this webinar today. As he mentioned, it's a lead-in to the EPN conference in Houston on March 6th through 9th. That conference in March, as you may know, starts with various pre-conferences, including an endowment pre-conference that's going to feature a number of different experts covering different endowment topics. We'll have plenty of small group working time to help you talk through what to do at your church. And we're going to have some terrific case studies on endowment use, especially for the community at large. We hope you might consider attending those in-person sessions as well. Today, however, we're going to start at the very beginning to help you get ready for new endowment gifts with today a practical guide to either starting a new endowment, it might be your first one, or possibly creating a new endowment fund if you are setting up a new fund that is different from one that you already have. We're going to start today assuming that you have a new gift, or perhaps expect one or more new gifts soon. In a couple of months, we're going to offer a second webinar on endowment readiness when you don't have any expected gifts yet, or perhaps don't even have agreement at your church that you should even try to develop an endowment. But today, our goal is to do two things. We want to lay out the practical steps to creating a new endowment, and also we want to help you see that this is a terrific opportunity to accomplish some broader church goals also. So here's just a little bit of context before we start. The Episcopal Church Foundation, or ECF, is a nonprofit that works only with Episcopal organizations. We have managed endowments for 25 years. We have worked with hundreds of churches, as well as dioceses, schools, and other organizations. We now manage well over $600 million in assets, but most notably, we help our clients with all endowment matters, and that includes investing, which is very much front and center, but it also includes endowment structure, ongoing endowment governance, and endowment giving. And as we advise on these broader issues, we have worked with many, many churches to set up a new endowment fund as something broader that they're trying to accomplish. So one side note before we go further, today during this webinar, We may refer mostly to churches and to vestries just for convenience, but the same principles that we're going to go through apply generally to other Episcopal organizations and their boards of directors. Okay, so here we go. When is it time to create a new endowment or a new fund? So there are three typical scenarios as you see here on the left side. First, you may have received a gift from a donor who has made plain to you that the gift should be an endowment. Now, donors might express that intent in a variety of different ways, and we're going to explain more about that in an upcoming slide. But in this case, you do have a legal obligation to place the funds in an endowment. That's pretty straightforward to do, as we're going to explain shortly. But the key is that the donor's intent for the gift overrides any preference that you have for the gift. And it overrides that preference, I should note, once you have accepted the gift. The donor's intent is paramount. And that's actually a good reminder that if you are talking with a potential donor about a possible gift, you might, in those conversations, wish to gently encourage, shall we say, gently encourage the type of gift that you would like to have. So then, still going down here on the left, the second case is you may have an unrestricted gift. And that's a gift that was made to the church generally. Something like, in the case of a will, something like, I hereby give $100,000 to St. Mary's Church. It's just to the church, nothing more is specified. When you have that type of a gift, and then the vestry decides to place that gift in an endowment, that's sort of the second case you have here. This is an excellent way to seed an endowment. Many churches start this way. One caution is that before you do that, you just want to make sure that you have an adequate reserve fund for any unexpected short-term needs, so that when you place this unrestricted gift in an endowment, you can commit to investing it for the long term. You also, in this case, of course, need to follow any church policy that you already have in place. Some churches require these gifts to be placed in an endowment unless there's some sort of special circumstance or special vote. So you'll want to check that. The last case here then on the left, the third scenario, is you may have proceeds from the sale of an asset. For example, the church has an empty lot. You do not need an empty lot. You sell it, and then you have cash to invest. This is not technically a gift, technically speaking, but we want to show it here because this is how many organizations do in fact get the initial money for an endowment. Typically here, there are no restrictions on purpose, what the endowment can be used for, but there could be, especially if you're looking at the sale of a rectory, for example, so it's best to review that in detail if that's your case. Okay, so we've covered there on the left the three basic sources of a new endowment. Then moving to the right, you have to decide where to place those new endowment funds. And you have a couple of choices. First, if you have an existing endowment fund, and if the new gift is the same type of fund for the same purpose, then you can go right ahead and place the gift directly in your existing endowment. This is a very easy structural solution, but you still want to go through all the practical steps that we will describe shortly to make sure that this new gift, and really to make sure that the entire endowment is as impactful as possible. Now, moving down, if the gift is for a different purpose, then you might consider creating a new fund inside an existing endowment. This might be the case if you have, let's say, the St. John's Endowment Fund, and then that fund already includes the Music Fund, the Building Fund, the Smith Family Fund, or whatnot. Now, let's say you want to create an outreach fund. It's a new fund, but it can be invested with the other endowment funds and then tracked separately. Finally, you might create an entirely new endowment. This is certainly going to be the case, obviously, if you don't have an endowment yet, but some organizations may want to have two separate endowment funds for sort of some good reason that's perhaps idiosyncratic to their church. So that sort of lays out when it's time. Then, as we said, we encourage you to see a new endowment as a terrific opportunity. And if you take away anything today, we hope it is this. The task ahead of you is not just a mechanical one. We need to adopt policies, form a committee, transfer money to an investment manager, get reports, and so on. But it is also an inspirational moment. This is a chance both to establish a new endowment and then here you get to fill in the blank, and to accomplish another broader, significant church goal. So it might be, and you see this here a little bit on the slide, it might be, we want to change how we talk about money, or we want to get new people involved in church leadership. We want to address the needs of a broader community. We want to improve how we budget. I mean, the list of possibilities is endless. But as we go through these slides, please keep thinking about what the opportunity might be at your organization, or if you don't know, who you might want to talk to find out. So now we are going to go into detail about the practical areas to address to make sure that your endowment is as fruitful as possible. And I will turn to Anne.
Great. Thank you, Karsten. So how do you make creating your endowment an opportunity that isn't just mechanical? Yes, there are some steps you need to take that will feel and that actually are more practical. They're the steps you see on this slide. You need to make sure that you and your leadership understand some key concepts related to endowments. You need to establish appropriate policies and governance, and you need to find the right investment partner. These are steps that you have probably already realized are necessary as you're thinking about what to do with these funds. To truly live into the opportunity that's presented by having new funds and to create a fruitful endowment, as we're talking about today, however, you need to bookend these core areas with two others: the vision for the endowment and a plan for how you will communicate about the endowment. It is connecting all of these areas that will create the foundation for success. And for the remainder of this webinar today, we are going to offer some thoughts and guidance on each area to help you see how you can easily walk through these steps. So first is vision. An endowment's vision is more than its purpose. It's expressing that purpose of your endowment in a way that connects to your church's mission. Crafting a short vision for the endowment is definitely not intended to be some sort of overwhelming exercise requiring you to have multiple strategic planning meetings. You can actually do this by answering just a few fundamental questions. So, why are you establishing this endowment at your church? And what is it going to do for you? How will it benefit your mission and ministry? We know that churches use endowments for so many different things: to maintain their property so that its beauty and function are preserved, to fund overseas missions, to enable outreach in the community, or to support core church activities like worship or music or formation. So you should define the reason for having an endowment at your church and what it will mean for you. And then also consider what impact the endowment should have. Will it make additional ministry possible? Will it mean that you can fund space improvements that will enable more people to access your space? If you define the impact that you are looking for up front, you will be more likely to actually realize it. Also, you want to think about how the endowment is connected to your other financial resources. The endowment is not going to operate in a vacuum, so you should think about how it fits into your overall financial picture and your other assets. You can gather the answers to these questions in a brief conversation among a few people to get you started. And then you just have one person craft those responses into a short vision that you can share more broadly for feedback. Root it in your organizational mission and make it simple and compelling. So just to give you an example to make this more real, let's suppose that your source of new endowment funds is the sale of a property. Karsten mentioned earlier that is one way that some churches get endowment funds. So you sell your property and you use the proceeds of that sale to create an endowment fund that you decide to call the Campus Fund. And the purpose is going to be to fund building and property maintenance and improvements. That very plainly stated purpose to fund building and property maintenance and improvements is important and necessary in your governing documents. To be turned into a vision for the endowment, it needs to communicate what the endowment is intending to accomplish and to be connected to your mission. So you can get a small group of people together, you can answer the questions that are on the slide, and you can think about the relationship between the endowment's purpose and the church's mission. And maybe in this case, you end up with a vision that's something like, our parish is not only a place of worship and a place of fellowship, but also a space for recovery group meetings, after-school tutoring, and a winter shelter. The Campus Fund supports these ministries and all our mission and ministry by covering some of the costs of operating and maintaining our building and grounds. Ideally, all church leaders, including both the vestry and endowment committee members, will own this vision that you've set out, and they will be able to talk to the parish about that vision in a way that connects. So moving from the more inspirational to the more practical, our next area that we're going to cover is basic endowment concepts. So as you're making your plan for these new funds, you need to review the answers to a few key questions. First, was the endowment created by a donor or by a vestry or a board in the case of organizations? Some of you might be asking, why does this matter? If the gift came from a donor who specified that it was for endowment, then you must honor that and understand that what you have is true endowment, an endowment that must last in perpetuity. If the funds you have came from a gift that was not specified as an endowment, or if you yourselves are making a decision to set aside as endowment funds that you otherwise could have spent, then what you have is a vestry or a board designated endowment. Understanding the source of your funds matters because the amount that you can spend from your funds and your ability to change the time horizon or the use of the funds will differ depending on whether the funds came from a donor or from a vestry set aside. It is important to educate yourself on the differences In previous webinars that Karsten and I have done, we have gone into more detail on the differences between true endowments and quasi-endowments. So if you haven't joined us before, or if this topic is completely new to you, please reach out. We would be happy to share some additional resources. So the second question to answer is, are these funds truly long-term? For most of the people that we talk to, they are very clear on understanding what it means to be a long-term fund when they receive a gift from a donor that's clearly for endowment. So if a donor gives you funds and says, preserve the principal or spend the income only or something like that, that is the donor telling you that this is a gift for endowment and it's perpetual, intended to last forever. What we see is that it's in making a decision to set aside other funds as endowment where a confusion about the time horizon can come in. So when you, as the leadership, are making a decision to set aside funds as endowment, it is especially important to get agreement and consensus that these are long-term funds. A long-term time horizon is 7 to 10 years or longer. When you decide that the funds that you are setting aside are endowment, you can invest them differently than you would funds that you need next year or even a few years from now. Sometimes we hear from churches who say, we are so thrilled. We've raised more money than we needed in our capital campaign, and now we have $50,000 left over, and we don't need it. Well, we don't need it for 2 years, so we want to invest it. Seeking out some short-term investment opportunities in that scenario might be appropriate, but that is not a long-term time horizon or money that could be described as endowment. Again, this is where it is so important to have agreement and consensus among your group about your ability to treat these funds as something that is for the long term, not something that you will use to fix the boiler in 2 years. So when you have a long-term fund, your investment approach will seek to balance conserving and growing for tomorrow with the need to fund your mission and ministry today. This is why endowments are commonly invested in financial markets in both equities and bonds, so that over time they can grow and earn, enabling you to spend a certain portion. And so, in fact, what can you spend? Hopefully, many of you are familiar with a state law that governs endowments that is known as the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, or MIFA. This state law defines the factors that you must consider when you are thinking about making a distribution from a true endowment. Again, a true endowment being an endowment created by a donor's intent. So when you have an endowment that is invested in a diversified portfolio of equities and bonds, that would be expected to grow over the long term, not in every year, but over the long term from both appreciation and income. And in that case, your spending decisions will be based on a prudent percentage of the total market value of the endowment. And you will determine that percentage by taking into account the factors that are described in the law. Said very simply, what you can spend from an endowment is not the whole amount. It is a prudent, typically small portion of the overall value that you will distribute to be used for whatever purposes were specified. And that gets us to our final question, which is, are there any restrictions on use? So a restriction on use would be something like, here's my gift as an endowment for music, or these endowment funds are for the building. If the gift came with restrictions on use, you need to make sure you understand those. And you also should think as expansively as is appropriate about them. So let's say, for example, that you have had a small music endowment for several years, and periodically you've taken a distribution to pay for new hymnals. Perhaps you've now received another new larger endowment gift for music, and having thought through the things that Karsten put in our earlier slide, you decide it is appropriate to place this new music endowment gift into your existing music endowment. It's now substantially larger. You have an opportunity to think more broadly now about what these funds are for. This isn't the hymnal endowment fund, it's the music endowment fund. So what else could these funds make possible? And if you are in the case where the gift came without restrictions on use, then this is your opportunity to do that vision work, to think about the purpose so that you can define the use and take that time to set out your vision. We talk a lot, as Karsten said earlier, to churches all around the country. And I think what we find is that sometimes people get a little bit tripped up on these concepts about the source of funds, the time horizon of the funds, or what they can spend from funds. So a parishioner might leave you a bequest, for example, and in that bequest say that the principal must be preserved forever. We have heard of treasurers who thought that what that meant was that they had to put the gift in a savings account or a money market fund because the gift could not be subjected to risk. A simple formulation where a donor gives you a gift and says, preserve the principal, is simply that donor telling you, I'm giving you an endowment. It is not a direction about what type of vehicle you should invest it in. Similarly, we are aware of churches who, when they've gotten a gift where the donor said, spend the income only, thought that was a literal direction on spending. Again, simple wording like this is how a giver tells you that they are making an endowment gift. It is not the giver providing specific directions about spending. So to summarize, make sure you understand the source of your endowment funds, their time horizon, and any restrictions on use, as these will inform your governing documents, which Karsten is going to talk about next.
Yes, great. Thanks, Anne. So here we are. Item number 3. You need to establish good governance for the fund that you create to ensure that you oversee it and use it as required. So good governance typically involves written policies, but it also includes various procedures that you establish for yourselves and that you follow. So I want to make 3 points before we go through the detail here. So 1, you want to work together with other church leaders to align the policies that you're going to prepare with church goals. This is exactly what we discussed at the start. Second, keep in mind that these policies and procedures will guide you now, and they will guide future church leaders and committee members so that there is continuity in how you conceive of and manage these funds over time. We often hear from new committee members who say they have no idea why their funds are invested as they are, and these types of policies will help provide that information to future leaders. And then third, when shared with the overall congregation, these governing policies, and this is really crucial, these policies help build trust among other potential donors that their gifts will be protected and used as they intend. So remember, in a church, every member of your congregation is a potential donor, and they will see you managing this new gift well, and they're going to learn and absorb that you would also manage their gift well. Okay, so let's go through this list. At the outset, you will write, and then the vestry will pass, resolutions or the equivalent to establish the fund, its purpose, and the body that will oversee the fund. These types of resolutions don't need to be complicated or onerous. It's just really a few simple paragraphs in plain English. We've helped dozens of Episcopal organizations craft such resolutions. And then just to be clear, there's nothing magical or mysterious about creating an endowment. It is simply your governing bodies, your vestry, the vestry's decision to do so. The vestry decides, pass resolutions, you are creating an endowment. And by proceeding in this way, you don't have a separate corporate structure or a separate tax ID number. The church remains the owner of the fund, and the fund is an asset of the church. This is certainly how we recommend that every church proceed. It's simple, it's cost effective, and it makes good use of what we know is limited volunteer time. So next, after that, the vestry will need to set up, or if it's already set up, perhaps reinvigorate a committee to oversee the endowment. The vestry always retains ultimate responsibility for the church's funds, but we strongly recommend that it delegates oversight of the endowment to an investment or endowment committee. Those terms really are interchangeable. Typically, then, the committee does the legwork. It does the analysis, it holds meetings, it drafts documents, and so on, and then it makes recommendations to the vestry for approval. The vestry, in turn, then has the responsibility to review regular reports from the committee to ensure that the committee is carrying out its responsibilities. So then you pass resolutions, you've got your oversight committee created or reinvigorated, and then the committee will prepare an investment policy statement, or IPS, for the vestry to approve. So this IPS spells out your investment approach and what responsibilities you will delegate to an outside investment manager. This IPS should also include a sort of overall spending policy, so it's clear how much the church can spend each year. Those would be guidelines that you review and then set specific amounts each year. We're going to talk more about investing on the next slide, but the point here is that in this IPS, you need to clarify your goals, your risk tolerance, Anne talked about that, and your spending needs. And then you will provide the overall direction for an investment manager to whom you will delegate responsibility for the detail, actually how the portfolio is invested. And then finally, we know that the best governing documents also include various gift acceptance policies. These help church leaders plan for new gifts and then also know what to do when they get a new gift. So at ECF, we have an excellent set of sample endowment policies that has, guidance and commentary throughout that we share with the churches and others that work with us. I'll just mention a few things about investment committees. The most successful committees not only oversee funds, but they also engage with everyone at the church to explain and promote the endowment. Anne talked about that before. She'll pick up again on that in a moment. It's also really terrific when members come from different professional backgrounds and bring a range of perspectives. Successful committees also include newer church members. You really want to show that there are leadership roles for newer members of your church. And there are term limits to make sure that your church benefits from, the vigor and the fresh ideas that new members can bring. Last fall, Anne and I did a webinar on effective endowment committees. And if you're interested in watching the replay of that webinar, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to share the link, and it goes into a little bit more detail about investment committees. Okay, now step number 4, planning to invest your funds. So as I mentioned, to invest, you will want to find an outside investment manager to do that. The committee that you have set up typically has responsibility for finding the manager with final approval by the vestry, and then the committee will set the general direction for the manager and then delegate to the manager the day-to-day responsibility for the portfolio. And just to be clear, this is certainly an area where we get a lot of questions. In today's market environment, and really also as a matter of good governance, to be honest, it's just generally not practicable and not advisable for a committee to invest the endowment itself. When the responsibility is delegated to an outside investment manager, the committee's role is then to set the overall guidelines, and this is really a very, very important step, and then to review the manager's implementation of those guidelines. This helps a committee stay focused on the strategic decisions that it has to make when investing endowment funds, and it helps it to stay focused on the long term, which is obviously the appropriate framework for an endowment. And basically, I guess here, what I would say is the church needs to make decisions about what it knows best, which is itself, its goals, its risk tolerance, and then delegate to a manager responsibility for what that investment manager knows best. What we've done here on this slide is we've laid out a few simple questions to help you select an investment manager or an investment advisor. That's also interchangeable. So you want to ask, what services does the advisor offer? What is their overall investment approach? And then what specific portfolio options would they offer to you? Are there any investment minimums? Some firms have really quite high minimums and some less so. So that's very important to ask. And then, of course, what is the fee structure? And make sure you go into fees in some detail, really breaking down all the different parts. These types of questions, asking these types of questions does not need to be laborious or time-consuming. Typically, you can do it in a single conversation with an investment manager. At ECF, we field these types of calls all the time, and obviously now serve as the investment advisor for over 300 different Episcopal organizations. But once you select the manager, how you then actually invest the funds will depend on your goals and other factors. There certainly are best practices to follow. Endowment funds should be invested in a broadly diversified portfolio. They should be invested for the long term in a variety of different asset classes. And those asset classes should balance expected risk and return, right? Two goals, sort of balancing risk and return over the long term. You will likely determine your specific investment strategy working in tandem with the investment manager that you select, and then you're going to document that in your specific investment policy statement, as we just discussed. Okay, whirlwind tour through investments. I'm going to turn back to Anne now for the final step.
Thanks, Karsten. So this last concept, communications, is often the crux of success. You can have taken all of the practical steps that we talked about and even done the short amount of work to develop a vision for your endowment fund. But if you don't make a plan to communicate about this, you will not realize the full potential of this opportunity in your parish. So here again, we have just a few key questions for you to answer in your own context to set you on the right path. First and foremost is, have you thanked the person making the gift? As Episcopalians, we know that our acts of worship are intentional acts of thankfulness. You probably know that the word Eucharist comes from a Greek word meaning thanksgiving. Yet for a people who are offering their thanks to God every single week, we can sometimes be remiss in thanking the people around us. So yes, send that thank you letter to your donor, or if this gift is coming in the form of a bequest, find out who you should send a thank you to. And while that formal thank you letter is absolutely a must, also think about other ways that you can communicate, whether you're going to place a phone call or send a handwritten note. This is an opportunity to live out your values and to develop and strengthen relationships. Next on communications, this gift is giving you an opportunity to have a very important discussion in your parish, and that is about whether and how it is appropriate in your own context to publicly recognize the donor. Not all donors seek this or want this, and it is not appropriate everywhere. Early on, maybe as soon as you learn that a gift is coming, you want to have a conversation in church leadership about your position on this, and you want to seek clarity on the donor's wishes. This gift is just one part of a much broader relationship that you have with this person. And so you want to handle this carefully and thoughtfully. And you also want to consider what precedent you are setting for your parish community and how you will follow through in the future on other gifts if you do decide that public recognition is important for this gift. Finally, the last piece of communications planning: how are you telling the parish and what are you going to tell them? So the how should be multifaceted. It's not just one announcement at one service. You probably have many ways that you talk to your people. Perhaps it's a weekly email. Maybe you have a church newsletter. Maybe you use social media. Maybe your church prefers flyers around the campus. You don't need to do every one of these things, but think about how you communicate with people and then decide which ways you are going to use in this instance to let people know. You have something really uplifting to share. You have a gift that is going to make a difference for your parish. So you want people to hear about it. The what is at a minimum 3 things: the vision for the endowment, the impact you expect it to make, and how anyone can make an endowment gift. So remember that an endowment's impact comes from the distributions, from spending some of the funds to enable mission and ministry today while conserving and protecting to be able to have funds tomorrow. We find when churches get endowment gifts that they most often talk about them by focusing on the overall size of the gift. But talking about the overall size of the gift actually obscures the impact. Yes, having a $1 million endowment is an incredible gift for a church. And what it means is that perhaps $40,000 annually will be available to help support your mission and ministry. Communicating about what you can prudently spend from the endowment and what that is going to make possible will help your parishioners better understand how the endowment impacts your church each year. We often say at ECF, if you've talked to us before, that endowments grow incrementally through investment returns and exponentially through new gifts. So how are you inviting the parish to be a part of contributing to the endowment? Have you let them know how to make a gift? Do you ever talk about it? fundamentally, this gift is your opportunity to strengthen relationships and inspire trust by planning your communications to thoughtfully share what is happening, what it means, and how anyone and everyone can be a part of it. So we have covered a lot in these 5 areas for creating a fruitful endowment. Summarizing in some very brief words, you are first going to craft a short vision statement that will unite your church or organization around shared values and goals. Next, you will review some basics about endowments and then the terms specific to your gift to anchor your governing documents. Third, you will adopt or perhaps in some cases update your written policies to help both current and future leaders oversee funds effectively. Fourth, you will gather some key information from potential investment advisors to inform your decision about investment management. And then finally, you will express gratitude and invite additional generosity by actually planning to communicate. So that concludes the formal remarks that we have prepared today. But we do still have a little time left. So as Joe said at the beginning, we are happy to take questions. Please ask those questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's usually just too much in the chat for us to figure out if there are questions in there. And one question that I know we always get, so I will just answer it right now. Yes, as you likely know, this webinar has been recorded and EPN will be posting the recording to its website within the week. So if you have others at your parish who you'd like to share this webinar with, please check the Episcopal Parish Network website later this week for the replay information. And then also for those of you who registered in advance, we will be sending out an email with the key takeaways from this webinar as well as the slides. So please keep an eye out for that. Now I'm going to ask Karsten if we have any questions.
Sure, and we do. I'm going to start with a couple of questions that relate to the case when you get an unrestricted gift to a church, and then the vestry decides to place it in an endowment. So I just want to clarify that when that occurs, the vestry is not actually restricting the funds. The vestry is saying, we are going to put this in an endowment. We are going to treat it as an endowment, invest it for the long term, spend just prudently. And in our minds, we are considering these as long-term funds. So from that, Anne, I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, if a vestry does that encumber a future vestry, or can the future vestry change the earlier vestry's decision?
Yeah, we get that question a lot. So again, when it was the vestry's decision to do this, right, when the donor themselves did not make the restriction, then a future vestry could determine to unwind that. The simplest case would be, we've sold something off, we've set aside money for ourselves, it's 50 years later, we now need all of this money. The current vestry decides to use all of that money. But it could similarly be the case that someone leaves you a bequest, and the bequest is simply, I leave $10,000 to Christ Church, period. Nothing else is stated. The vestry at the time says, great, we'll consider this $10,000 part of an endowment, and we won't spend it except for that prudent portion. We'll invest it over time. Again, 25, 30, 40 years later, a new vestry comes in. There's a really good need. Maybe there's an opportunity to acquire a property next door. Your church is growing. You can use that entirety of that and spend that all to make that acquisition. So that's why it's so important, and we emphasize at the beginning, understanding the source of your funds, because if the source was from a donor's intent from endowment, you could not do that. Yeah. But if the source is people who are just giving money to the church, The vestry today can decide to set aside those funds, and the vestry many years from now can make a different decision based on what is needed at that time.
Right. Just a couple follow-on thoughts there, and this gets at some other questions as well. I mean, in a way, if you trust yourself today as vestry members, you want to know that you can you want to assume that you can trust future vestry members as well. They will have the best interests of the church in mind, given whatever circumstances they face 20, 30, 40 years later, ideally. Another thing is that when a vestry decides to put unrestricted funds into an endowment, this is a great opportunity to build out the narrative of why you do that. And that could be in the resolutions that create the fund. It could be in your governing documents. It could be in meeting minutes. It could be in an announcement to the overall congregation. But this might help create a real commitment to this fund as an endowment, even in the face of an unknown future. That might not be controlling, but certainly church culture helps. Another point to make is if you as a vestry do this, is totally unrestricted dollars, no purpose, no perpetuity, and you decide to place it in an endowment, it may be to your advantage to give that fund a very expansive purpose so that you preserve the flexibility for yourselves in the upcoming years or way down in the future to have a little bit more freedom to use that for whatever purpose. Don't limit it just to new programming or just to a building, but say, you know, anything in support of the mission of the church, and just rely a little bit on the good sense of your future vestry members. So that's a little bit on that. Let me just think here what I can combine. We've gotten a lot of questions. Okay, I'm just going to go back. So someone asked a question about investing, and then there's another one that I might follow on to that. This one, Anne, is about if we're supposed to be in a diversified portfolio, what about just selecting a single diversified fund and a fund company rather than working with a manager? And I think that might get a little bit to the additional angles of investing that a potential manager might approach.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a single fund that an external manager that meets your investment goals and risk tolerance, there's not a particular reason why you couldn't do that. But it's important to think about what is the totality of services that you might need or want and that you will get out of that manager or not. Second, how are you going to get reporting on how that fund is doing and how will you understand it versus alternatives that you could have done? And third, that fund, there's so many, it's hard to generalize because there are so many different types of funds out there, but that may be set at a certain ratio, for example, of equities to bonds. And when you work with an investment manager, they will often position the portfolio to take advantage of shorter term market environments, even as they keep an eye, of course, on the long term. And you typically lose out on that type of shorter term positioning when you go into a fund that is set at a particular target. But again, depending on sort of your own goals and risk tolerance, there may be single funds out there that can serve this purpose. You just have to decide if that also comes with the services that you want.
Yeah, good. I have a couple of questions here about endowment giving. I'm going to try and lump them together, see how I do. So one is, what would be considered good timing for an endowment initiative, especially when a church is also doing annual stewardship, possible campaign? So that's one. Who might be a good group of people to approach for an endowment gift? And then, yeah, maybe start with that.
Sure. On the timing, so you can do all the things if you think about it, plan for it, communicate well. Sure, annual pledge campaign time is intense and you are focused on garnering those pledges to fund your church next year, you could also run a campaign for current endowment gifts during that. If you get both those groups together working on that, communicate well between them, think about your plan, and make sure that people understand why they're being asked to give both a pledge for general church operations next year and a gift right now to your endowment. Churches have done that. They can do it. It will not work without strong planning and communications. Another time that you can do it is you're running a capital campaign, and you also at that same time invite additional current gifts for your endowment. If what you are trying to do is not a current gift endowment campaign, as in we'd like to build an endowment right at this moment, so we're seeking your gifts today, but rather you're seeking commitments for people to make a legacy gift to the church at the end of their life that will become a part of an endowment. I think there are a lot of natural times in the church year when you can do a sort of that's not really, I wouldn't call that a campaign per se. That just becomes information that you are presenting at different times throughout the church year to encourage becoming a legacy giver. We talked to our churches with us about many of these different opportunities. Lent, which of course is coming up, can be a good time to invite these types of commitments, but it's not the only time of the year. There are certainly others that you can use. So I personally do not believe there's some hard and fast rule about when you should do this, or that you should never do it with an annual campaign, or you should always do it with an annual campaign. A lot depends on your church context, and a huge amount depends on what I talked about today, which is just communications generally, which so many times we in our parishes can do a little bit better and more clearly. And then the second question was about, remind me, sorry. So timing was the first one. And then,
who are the potential donors
oh,
to
who?
the endowment?
So everyone, right? Like there's no, church is different than other nonprofits, right? Other nonprofits have a different type of relationship with their quote unquote donors. I mean, we've been using the term donors throughout this webinar, but we're talking really, I mean, this is your friends. These are your parishioners. These are the people that you go to dinner with. These are the people you worship with. These are the people you are in book group with. So you have this different relationship with them, and everyone can contribute to the endowment. It is not about the size of a gift. And in fact, there are some churches who accept current gifts to the endowment, and people make them just like a little bit of a pledge, right? They make their normal pledge for current operations, and then they give another monthly gift that goes specifically to the church's endowment. It may be a quote unquote small amount, but they are still contributing to the long-term sustainability of your church. So I would say it is everyone. And if what you are going to do is hold some sort of a legacy campaign type event, right, where you're inviting people to make that commitment, those types of events and conversations are open to everyone, and everyone has an opportunity to contribute.
We're running out of time. We have so many great questions. I want to end just on one more because it touches back on this issue of restrictions, which is one that can be complicated. Here's a question about a gift that's restricted as to the purpose. For example, maintenance of buildings and grounds, but doesn't necessarily have to go into an endowment. So the donor therefore said, this is a gift of $100,000 for building and grounds, with no further indication that it has to be an endowment. So you have a couple choices there. And Anne, maybe just a quick review of that before we end.
Yeah, absolutely. So in a lot of cases, I mean, again, I don't know the exact context of this gift, but sometimes people make a gift like that because they've heard the rector or the vestry say things like, we need to fix the roof, or we need to replace the boiler, and where are the funds for that? And then they are wonderfully generous and they make that gift. And so you spend it because you need to replace the boiler or you need to fix something at the church. This is where, again, sort of the comments I made in the beginning about deciding on the time horizon of the funds is so important. If you have a sufficient building maintenance fund, you're feeling good about where you are in pledges, you've assessed your property and you have no strong upcoming maintenance needs, you could determine to set that aside as endowment, look to grow it, and maybe not spend anything from it until you have a large spending need for the building. But that is why it is so important to have these conversations among the vestry and get agreement and consensus that yes, we can set these aside, we can invest them, and maybe in several years, we'll come back and say, what is available to spend? And potentially, again, because this was not an endowment, we'll spend the whole thing because at that time, we need $200,000 to fix the roof. And this fund has grown to $200,000. So it comes down to that question of what is the time horizon? How quickly do you believe you will use up those funds? Can you set them aside? So we are getting right to the top of the hour. So I just want to, as we close today, say how grateful we are to have had the opportunity to spend time with you. My favorite part of my role here at the Episcopal Church Foundation is getting to talk to churches all across the country and helping to address their endowment management needs. If anything that you have heard today has sparked your interest or generated additional questions, please feel free to reach out to either one of us. You can see our contact information is here on the screen. And I just want to say again, this event is a precursor to the Episcopal Parish Network in-person conference coming up in Houston at the beginning of March. We will be there March 6th and 7th for the Endowment Pre-Conference, and we hope to meet many of you in person. And on behalf of the Episcopal Church Foundation and the Episcopal Parish Network, thank you for attending our webinar today.
Thanks, everyone.